On the social collective. Recently I made a video wherein I asserted that collectives don't exist. Like most of my uploads, it was an off-the-cuff, stream of consciousness video, and I wasn't as clear as I could have been regarding some of the concepts discussed. In light of recent events and heightened racial tensions, I think it is important to clarify my comments. This video will be scripted for that reason. Collectives are concepts. They don't exist in the real world. Only that which they describe exists. Some collectives are useful, while others can be harmful. Behavioral collectives can certainly be useful, as can be statistical collectives for the purpose of resource allocation. The collectives I will be referring to in this video are what I would call social collectives. Collectives are often fluid and amorphous. Given genetic diversity, for example, what genetic percentage would be required to retain membership in a given racial collective? I would generally leave that to the scientists to determine, for the purposes of meaningful data acquisition, the understanding of biology, etc. What happens, however, is that these collectives, as utilized in the social realm, are manipulated in ways to support ideological positions or even to foment racial tension. I've often heard of the criticism within the black community of people who are not black enough, or not really black. But this assertion is not indicative of some genetic assessment, but rather of opinions or behaviors. Further, we've heard the term Oreo, referring to a person who is quote-unquote black on the inside, but white on the inside, end quote. This is evidence of social collective being used to manipulate, in this instance, manipulation by exclusion. The aim here is to allude to a uniform collective, and this manipulation of exclusion is evidence of the real purpose of the social collective, to further the injustice of prejudice against the individual. Simply put, in this way we are witnessing social control. In fact, the term Oreo is actually a backhanded recognition of that individuality on some level. A nonconformity dressed up as membership in the other, necessarily uniform group, in this case, white people. Social collectives used in this way are not helpful, nor are they healthy. Social collectives used in this way are generated to create division and to demonize. These social collectives contain inescapable attributes. In other words, the collective white people might seem at first glance an innocent categorization of a genetic group. There are uses for this collective. In a social sense, however, people often assign baggage to the collective, and this baggage then becomes an inherent part of the asserted collective. Worse, the baggage is deemed inescapable on an individual level. I'm reminded of YouTube personality Milo Stewart's assertions that all white people are racist, all men are misogynistic, and all cis people are transphobic. Milo is not alone in these assertions. They can be found all over the internet, as can similar negative assertions such as black people cannot be racist. Ultimately, these assertions become wrapped up in our social use of collectives, again as inherent characteristics that are inescapable on an individual level. These social collectives seek to rob individual experience by making broad assertions about experience, both experience of personal injustice and the personal degree of enculturation. In my case, being raised removed from the broader culture for many of my formative years is denied and supplanted by an assumption of acceptance of cultural norms. These social collectives also deny individual agency and virtue, as though no one member of a collective could see beyond cultural narratives and call bullshit. In fact, there are many people of traditionally privileged classes who have independently identified oppressive attitudes and policies and fought against them. In essence, these social collectives are tribal. What is often hidden is that the formation of social collectives is centered around making them prescriptive when they should really only be descriptive. All white people are racist is an attempt to fold into the collective white people the inescapable prescriptive element of racism. After some time, all that needs to be said is white people, or the attribute of whiteness, for this all-encompassing prescriptive collective to be understood and assumed. Historically, social collectives have been used to further and to rationalize discrimination against minority groups. We as a species seem to have been forever engaged in this lockstep dance of tribalistic prejudice and demonization using the social collective. In this way, social collectives underpin all racial and gendered injustice. It is my assertion that injustice happens to individuals, not collectives. One cannot put a concept into a gas chamber. I think it is important to recognize this because the social collective ignores individual attitudes and experiences, including injustice. For instance, not all blacks suffered uniformly as a result of segregation, and not all Jews suffered equally during the Holocaust. Many escaped physical, legal, or even existential ramifications from these events. The injustices that occurred happened to individuals. And while I understand that the pronouncements that preceded these dastardly events were made about the collectives, blacks or Jews, this only serves to further underscore my point about the dangers of social collectives, also known as prejudice. Not only does the social collective give an inadequate picture of the real injustice suffered by individuals within the oppressed collective, it also ignores the individual injustice suffered by those considered to be in the privileged collective. Think of the well-known accidental YouTube character AIDS Skrillex shouting, "You're a fucking white male!" Not only is this statement indicative of an assumption of attitudes, but also of an assumed set of experiences or lack thereof. The term violence against women carries an inherent assumption that all women are sufferers of violence, and generally at the hands of men. First off, I feel that this collective statement serves to numb us somewhat to the depth of violence some women experience at the individual level. There are multitude cases of people attempting to insert all manner of microaggressions into this category, essentially diluting the concept. I feel this represents an injustice to those who have suffered unspeakable injustices within the same category. Moreover, there is an unspoken collective inverse here, that there is no violence against men. We certainly don't often hear of it spoken of in this way, but this manipulative social collective also assumes that said violence is perpetrated by men, and therefore men are the purveyors of violence, not the recipients of it. Perhaps this is why we don't often hear of same-sex female violence, even though it is one of the most prevalent forms of partner violence per capita. Similarly, we often hear on YouTube and elsewhere that black people can't be racist. The assumption, of course, is similar to the violence against women construct. Now, I do understand that the assertion is that racism is prejudice plus power, but I reject that notion. In fact, I feel that assertion is just another attempt at forming a manipulative social collective that carries inherent and inescapable attributes. These are: all white people are racist, because white people have traditionally had the power, and consequently, black people cannot be racist for the same reason. Naturally, individual experience counters this assertion. This is a manipulation of language. Prejudice is the presumption of inescapable attributes based on race, gender, social status, etc., on an individual level. Racism often involves an element of superiority or inferiority assumed based on race. Discrimination is acting on those beliefs, treating people differently according to their race alone. Treating people as a social collective rather than as individuals and based on individual interaction and merit. I would accept institutional racism or structural racism as descriptors of what people are referring to when they say black people can't be racist, because they at least reference the power differential that may exist, and these terms do not exclude black people from negative attitudes and discriminatory practices. Keep in mind, of course, that as time progresses, power has shifted, and it's not always at the institutional level. There is a social power dynamic at play as well. And since that power dynamic is shifting, absolute statements such as black people cannot shed light on a disingenuous narrative more than they do to say anything meaningful. Think about which groups remain in the camp of people that it's okay to say bad things about. Imagine yelling, "You're a fucking black female!" at someone, and the social backlash you'd quickly and severely receive. It is impossible to right the wrongs of prejudice with further adherence to the social collective concept. In a previous video, I'd mentioned a woman who had attempted to attend the University of Texas and was denied due to the attempt at restorative justice called affirmative action. Now, assuming that she had superior individual merit, SAT scores, etc., this was an individual injustice levied in an attempt to correct collective injustice, because there was no attempt to assert that on an individual level she had perpetrated some sort of injustice upon that minority who took her place at the university as justification for this placement. Further, there was no attempt at identifying whether or not the minority applicant had suffered significant injustice to warrant preferential placement. All that took place, as far as I can see, was to simply identify membership in a traditionally oppressed social collective as reason enough. This is essentially what happened in Dallas recently, as Micah Johnson sought revenge against a collective, both in his writings and his actions. Micah Johnson denied individual injustices by perpetrating them, based on collective assumptions. Yes, it is quite possible and even very likely that some of the injustices that fueled Johnson's anger were motivated by the very same kind of social collective assumptions or prejudice. But when do we recognize this cycle and put an end to it? Additionally, there were many horrific tweets of support for what Micah Johnson perpetrated. And while the social collectives demonized varied slightly, whites, cops, white America, the inherent assumptions of inescapable attitudes and experiences were the same. Now, I recognize that many of the examples I've given are of injustices or attitudes against traditionally privileged groups. Rational and reasonable people already know, accept, and rail against the injustices against traditionally oppressed peoples. We educate our children about these injustices. It is the repetition of the process of formulating harmful social collectives that concerns me. We are repeating the errors of history. Again, I recognize that some collectives are useful. I'm speaking specifically of those social collectives that promote prejudice, manipulate language, and attempt to manipulate the history of human experience. I detest revisionist history. In closing, let me remind you that it was a black man who once said he had a dream of a world where a person would be judged by the content of his character and not the color of his skin. We cannot achieve understanding or peace until we extend the consideration of individuality to one another, and it has to start somewhere. And one last thing. Our children are watching. Thank you for watching.